Welcome to the opening session of the Virtual Summit on Just Transition, which is organized by Slyken Trust with the support and collaboration with different organizations. And this session is co-led with the UNFCCC Secretariat. And just a bit of a warning before we start, I'm talking from Sri Lanka, so we are having a bit of a bad weather situation in the country. In case there's, so we are having a cyclone, and we are trying to join from different places. So in case there's a power cut or a signal issue with the Wi-Fi, that someone else will take over to moderate this session. So we are hoping it won't happen, but just giving you a fair warning. So I would like to request the speakers to continue the speaking if there's a drop from our end, from the moderation side, so we can continue with the session. So to start off, I would like to invite Dr. Mustafa Kamagi, who is the coordinator for Green Jobs for program at the ILO, to give an overview of what Just Transition is and how it looks in his work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vasita and colleagues. So I would just want to share my screen. I have, yes, I would just want to use a, okay, fantastic. So first of all, I really would like to appreciate the opportunity you've provided to the International Labour Office to join you at this very important session. And we also are with you in this difficult moment, with colleagues right now in Sri Lanka, and I'm hoping that everything will go well for this session and for the coming days. I will try to make it short so that we have a lot of time for interaction. I would just want to say, if everybody, some may not be familiar with the International Labour Organization, just one word, that the ILO is a specialized agency of the United Nations that has been established in 1919. So it's one of the, if not the oldest agency in the UN system. And the ILO is essentially mandated to promote social justice around the world and to promote decent work for all. Now, in the context of that work, the ILO constituents, and here I would like to mention one specificity of the ILO as a UN agency, which is that it is a tripartite organization. So what it means is that the constituents of the ILO are not made of only representatives of governments, but also representatives of employers organizations and workers organizations. So in a way, we are fortunate to have all the key actors in the real economy coming together to shape international labor standards and support global action on decent work. Now, in this work, the ILO constituents have come over time to realize that unless environmental challenges, of which climate change is obviously a fundamental challenge, are not addressed, it would be very difficult to achieve the goals of social justice and promote a decent work for all. So this is why there has been a corporate effort to integrate environmental sustainability in the work of the organization. Now, in doing that, the program I am leading at the ILO has been working first on the analytics, and we've tried to understand the nature and scale of the impacts of climate change on the world of work. And doing that, one of the studies we've conducted about 2 years ago was to test what could be the impacts on jobs if countries go ahead and implement the Paris Agreement on climate change. So the graph you're seeing here is an indication of those findings, that we see that if countries focus on 3 areas, which is promoting greater use of renewable sources of energy, improvements in energy efficiency and the deployment of electric vehicles on a larger scale, it would be possible to generate an additional 24 million jobs by 2030. However, we see in this big picture a number of important regional variations. Some parts of the world, not to be Asia Pacific, which is the region we are in right now, and Europe and the Americas will see gains in jobs. However, some other parts of the world, in particular the Middle East and parts of Africa, may see decline in employment. And this is mostly in countries that will have to rely for some time to come on fossil fuels, while the rest of the world is actually moving out of fossil fuels. So therefore, it's important to see this picture of job creation, job displacement. But the good news is that in the end, we see a net gain in employment, and this is in the order of 18 million jobs. Now, we've run a much larger analysis, which looked at two scenarios. The one I just talked about now is about the energy transition, but there is another analysis which looked at the circular economy transition. I would just focus on the energy transition because it's particularly important when we talk about climate change. So, and here what I want to share, which is relevant to our discussion on just transition, is where we see job creation. I mentioned this 25 million, but also loss of employment. And this means that there will be a very important need for skilling, reskilling, and upskilling, so that not only the opportunities for new job creation are captured and materialized, and second, for those who might be redundant workers in sectors that will see decline in employment be redeployed in other economic sectors. So in this graph, we see that about of the 7 million of job destruction that we estimated, 5 million could be reallocated actually in the clean energy space with reskilling and upskilling. But there's a risk of losing 2 million jobs if there are not right policies for reskilling, upskilling. So I'm just talking of skills here, but it's important to keep in mind that there are many other social and labor market policies that need to come into picture. So this graph is about the circular economy, but more or less it gives us the same picture in terms of where we see the new job creation, risks of job displacement. And again, that's the same message on why it's important to have right policies on skills and others to enable smooth transition in labor markets. One important message that comes out of our analysis is that there are important gender dimensions. In the energy transition scenario, we find that 19 million out of the 25 million new job creation that we see are captured by mid-career male workers, and only 6 million are going to female workers. And that's the same picture when you look at the circular economy scenario. So therefore, what it means is that in the green economy, it is not by default that the gender bias and disparities we see today in labor markets will be bridged. It will only be bridged through dedicated policies that reinforce the participation of female workers in the emerging occupations and in the labor markets. Now, this takes me to the policies and goals of policies for a just transition. So to make it very simple, what we really mean and want to see in a just transition is to understand that there will be different economic and social impacts. On the one hand, of policies to deal with climate change and the physical effects of climate change itself, and how do we maximize those social economic gains on the one hand and minimize the risks on the other, so that no one is left behind. So for us, that's what a just transition is about. So we think that it's important for countries and actors to start with understanding the scale and nature of these impacts. And that's the analytical part. This could be done globally as we've tried, but it's important to conduct these kinds of assessments and analysis at the national level. A second important aspect is the need to forge strong social consensus. We think that tripartite social dialogue, engagement with community and local actors is important so that governments make clear to people and actors in the economy what is the direction of policy. And so we think that citizens around the world are all wanting to see ambitious action of their governments on climate change, but they want to understand the direction of policy and what it means for them. And so therefore it's very important to build that strong social consensus. And finally, there is a mix of policies that are required. I spoke about skills, but we also need to have policies on social protection, enterprise development, issues of occupational safety and health. So there's a range of policies. And the next slide is just giving us how in the ILO we've come up with a set of guidelines for a just transition, which puts all of this in a coherent framework where we look at different kinds of macro employment, social policies, issues of rights at work that we believe combined with climate policies will be able to deliver a just transition with more and better jobs for all. I wanted to just end by zooming a little on where we see the nationally determined contribution going right now, and whether countries are really embedding labor, social skills development, social policies in NDCs. We find that it's not really reaching the level that is required. When we examined NDCs in 32 countries, we find that less than 40% of those NDCs include plans for skilling and reskilling of the workforce. And we find that only over 20, but there's a reference to human capacity, but specific policies developed in a coherent manner are kind of missing. Over 20% do not plan at all human capacity related activities, and this could be an obstacle to reach ambition. So I just want to end by mentioning the Climate Action for Jobs initiative. This is one initiative the ILO has been tasked to implement. It comes from the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit, and it is meant to be a global program to support efforts on just transition, where we look at all the policies I mentioned and package them with climate ambition so that we can allow countries to go further and with more speed, while ensuring that the social dimensions are fully addressed and that no one is left behind. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't been long, and I look very much forward to engaging in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. That was a great presentation. It pretty much gave an overview of a lot of things we're discussing today and tomorrow. So it's a great start. And now we have Dr. Kusum Lata, who is from the UNFCCC Secretariat. They are co-leading this session with Like and Trust. Over to you. I won't give a long introduction to you because it's already on the webpage. Let's go to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Washtad, and welcome to all of you in this virtual summit on just transition. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you are joining it from. I'm very sorry that there was a little bit of glitch to join this meeting at the start, but I hope that I could still make up for the time which was lost in that. I wanted to start this virtual seminar just by asking why today we are actually talking about just transition. We know that just transition has been repeatedly used and consistently being used nowadays. And it's been like anytime we open up our emails, there are a lot of webinars, meetings happening around it. It was not that popular a few years or few months ago. And I'm sure that something drastic must have happened, which is making a lot of companies and organizations and institutes talking about it. And what exactly is that? And that is what we have to understand today when we are talking about climate change actions which we are taking. I think, in my view, this is a symbol of acknowledgement that livelihood of people is important, and they are also very important and to be taken in manner in this transition when we are going towards low emission economies. What do we really understand about this just transition? We know that there is no specific internationally agreed definition to it. There is a definition which has been given by ILO, but it's not something under the climate change negotiations or under the climate change regime which has been accepted right now. And that is why we will see that whenever we listen to these discussions, they are being talked about from different perspectives, because just transition is not only applicable for people, but it is also applicable for all the agencies, all the stakeholders, our businesses, our firms, and also our people. And when we talk about firms, we mean that it is the firms which are also going to operate in a different manner. And when we talk about businesses, I think the businesses are also going to be impacted by this transition which is happening, and they also need to operate in a different way. For example, they need to procure some different materials, they need to deal with different kind of clients, they have to probably increase or change their regime where they are operating, or maybe the kind of businesses they were doing before. So it's not only we are talking about people, but we are also talking about like everyone which is being impacted by these climate change actions. And that is why we will see that even the banks, our investing organizations, and including our energy ministries, everyone is talking about this just transition. But when we talk here in UNFCCC, we are specifically talking about more on workforce, because first thing is that just transition in 1990s, we saw that in the start also as preamble to this virtual meeting, that it is something, a term which was actually established a long time ago, or I should say, it was used more often in that manner when the people are getting unemployed due to environmental protection policies. And that's why it get related very well to climate change actions, because climate change actions are also taken in terms of environmental perspective. And if we see in UNFCCC Paris Agreement, or if we see our UNFCCC convention, it is always talked about workforce. If we see in that way in the preamble of Paris Agreement, it also says very clearly that countries need to take into account the just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs while they are making transition to their low emission economies. In that sense, I would say that Paris Agreement recognizes that parties are affected not only by climate change, but also by climate actions taken by it. And it also said very clearly that we have to take into account all those imperatives of just transition, which is coming or which is happening to the workforce and also to their jobs. In this sense, the major breakthrough came in COP24, when we are talking about Katowice, which is just 2 years back, where just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs as a full term was included in the work program of the forum. Now, what is forum? Forum is actually a place where all the parties who are interested in talking about this, some stakeholders, it provide a platform, it provide a space for all the interested stakeholders, mainly parties, to talk about these issues and get an agreement what need to be done in this, what kind of international agreements need to be taken in this context, and what to be done next. And in that way, there was also a committee which was established in Madrid, which is last year in Madrid, where, in Katowice, where not only the forum, but also a committee was established to do some technical work on it. And why we need technical work? Because we know that there is a lot of understanding. We just heard from Kamal that there are technical work need to be done, which can make countries, organizations, these businesses, firms to understand really what kind of impacts they are receiving. We can say that jobs are getting increased, but also there is another aspect which always been talked about, that jobs are being created, but are they being created for the same people who are losing their jobs? Is it being created at the same place, at the geographical location where it has been lost, or it is created for the same people or at the same time? So those kind of aspects also need to be addressed, and who is actually being impacted. It's not that everyone is getting impacted. Maybe when you implement your policy, say coal mine is getting closed, then it is the people of coal mines who are getting impacted, and how the transition of these people should take place. And in that sense, I am sure sometimes maybe one of you or some of you have heard that ILO has guidelines to guide countries how they should really take forward this work of just transition, including talking to people. They usually call it as a social dialogue, and make it an inclusive process of transition. And these kind of understandings need to be created, and has to be established, and has to be understood by even the countries who are implementing just transition, or I should say countries who are implementing climate actions. And unless they implement these kind of guidelines or a follow-up process, if they do not hear concerns of people, these climate actions can never be as ambitious as we want, and they cannot be as successful as we want. So these kind of discussions are actually taking place in this Katowice committee, and then which creates a lot of knowledge around it, and which can be then taken forward in the forum where parties can decide what need to be done. In that sense, last year in Madrid, there was a six-year work plan which was agreed. And in this 6-year work plan, if we see, there are actually 4 work program areas. One of them is just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. But I would not say that this is the only one work program area which is related, because there are 2 other work program areas which are very much complementing this particular work on just transition, because it is dealing with understanding assessment of impacts of implementation of response measures, and it is also dealing with development of tools and methodologies. And why these 2 complements? Because unless we use these kind of tools, unless we do these kind of analysis, we do not know who is getting impacted. And once we know who is getting impacted, only then we can make a plan for transition. So first, I think the first step is to understand those impacts, and to understand those impacts, there is a very important role which these tools and understandings create. And this kind of knowledge has to be created by this technical body. This has to be created also by a lot of stakeholders. Many of you today listening to this conversation, I think you have a very important role to play in this, creating these knowledges, because these academic organizations are really creating a lot of knowledge which can be used, because you are research organizations, you are think tanks, and you think about all those aspects of people, and you have a lot of knowledge base on that. In that sense, I would say that with this aim, when this work plan is being created, there are almost 11 activities which are to be implemented over a period of 6 years. And 11 activities will create, I am sure, a lot of opportunities in the form of creating technical documents. It has also a lot of activities which will allow the stakeholders to exchange ideas, exchange information on specific aspects related to this transition. And I would say that there is also an opportunity for all the stakeholders to provide their inputs, because it is a very thoughtful concern, or I should say action, which has been included, that every activity need to be implemented by Katowice committee. There is a way of receiving inputs from experts. So the committee is trying to engage the stakeholders as much as possible so that they can learn. It's not only the matter of these 14 people who are talking about these aspects. There is a huge knowledge around in this world, and they need to always take into account all that knowledge. And that is why I encourage all of you who are listening today that you should make your inputs on these topics when they are being discussed very specific and very relevant, so that your knowledge can be included in their discussion and they are doing their work with that knowledge already having with them. Recently, KCI had its third meeting, which was in this particular meeting, they discussed how to enhance capacity of parties on assessment of impacts of implementation of response measures. And this was discussed specifically to facilitate just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs, but also to aim to facilitate economic diversification. And all these two things, I would say, just transition and also economic diversification, this they want to achieve through collaboration of stakeholders. And why economic diversification is also important, because when we are talking about transition of people and managing these impacts, the transition is also happening, as I said, to the businesses as well. So jobs have been created maybe in the same industry, but completely in a different manner. So energy industry is transitioning completely to a new kind of operational aspects. This is called economic diversification, and this is really important for economies which are so dependent on fossil fuel based exports or fossil fuel based economies. And if these economies are impacted, definitely the people are also impacted. So these countries has to diversify their economy. And that is why diversification is very important when we are talking about transition of people as well and managing impacts on them. So these are basically the concepts. These are basically the regime where we are operating under UN convention. Usually this technical body, which is, I would say, little bit of a new compared to all other established bodies which are working under the convention. It's just 2 years old. But if you can already see that this, although it is just 2 years old, it is already a very established committee which is producing work, which is producing results, and which is already creating a lot of awareness. And I am sure that with this engagement, with this establishment of this institutional arrangement, there is a long way to go and act very fast. But to conclude my this discussion today related to what is happening under the Convention on Just Transition, I would like to mention that we have recently witnessed a very sudden shock of impacts on our societies, on our jobs, on our economies due to this health pandemic. And we all have witnessed there is a lot of policies which have been taken place. It is very good to see that these policies are already taking into account climate change policies as well. But this is an alarm, because it has already showed us what kind of these environmental aspects can bring to us in suddenly. If we do not listen to this alarm and do not create our policies to safeguard ourselves to the changes which is happening, we are quite late. Early we act, better we are. So both of these calls for very early understanding of these impacts on people, on societies, and very early actions need to be taken to manage them. And I am very sure that most of the countries, when we see their economic recovery packages, they have already included climate policies as one of the aspects in that. And if the transition of people can also be included in that as a very important aspect, it will be very good way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kusum. Kusum and the team are working very hard in capacity building of countries and engaging stakeholders. And I'm grateful that you were able to join us in between all the climate dialogue sessions that are happening as well the last 2 weeks, actually this week as well. So thank you. Now let's move on to our next speaker, who will be focusing about how laws and policies could facilitate just transition. Mr. Christoph Schwatt, Director, Legal Response Initiative. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rosita, and thank you all for having me. I have been asked by Rosita, because lawyers tend to complicate matters, to prepare a short PowerPoint presentation. And I hope you can see that now. My organization is based in London. We work with developing countries, mainly in the international climate negotiations, but increasingly also support them in implementing their commitments under the Paris Agreement domestically. There is a whole debate on what climate change law is. I won't bore you with what is probably mainly an academic discourse. And you can also have the same discussion, of course, about a just transition law, environmental laws, labor law, company law, planning law, energy, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't think that's particularly useful, but I think whenever you talk to lawyers, you'll find that they get excited by the question, what is just? So I just want to look at these two levels of the law, international, and there, of course, I will once again talk a little bit about the Paris Agreement and probably complement what Kusum has already said, the Green Recovery Principles of the UN Executive Secretary, and then the national level, human rights and climate justice, and also domestic legislation. The Paris Agreement mentions the just transition in the preamble. And the preamble then informs the interpretation of the convention, of this international treaty. The term did not make it into the operational part of the Paris Agreement. Nevertheless, it is, as Kusum mentioned, reflected in a number of provisions. And just to highlight maybe Article 4, Paragraph 1, carbon neutrality, that is, offsetting emissions against carbon reductions and avoidance should be reached in the second half of the century on the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable developments and efforts to eradicate poverty. And then adaptation is also a key component and makes a contribution to the long-term global response to climate change in order to protect people, livelihoods, and ecosystems. So I think the idea of a just transition is clearly reflected in those provisions. Overall, the Paris Agreement addresses not only mitigation, but also finance, technology transfer, capacity building, and so on. And that's largely an achievement of developing countries that fought very hard that it is not just about reducing and controlling emissions. Parties have to make voluntary bottom-up commitments in their NDCs. And the idea is that over time, they gradually increase their commitments. And these commitments are related to mitigation, but, and that's also been mentioned, can equally relate to adaptation efforts, and they can list their the impacts of climate change, and they can also indicate their financial needs, their capacity building needs, and for instance, what they are planning to do on retraining the workforce or diversifying jobs. But I also wanted to briefly look at Article 2, which captures the goals of the Paris Agreement. And here, the international community to date has very much focused on the mitigation angle. The idea is that countries collectively limit the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius but also pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. But there are two other goals which, are just as important, if you ask me. It's to strengthen the ability to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change and improve climate resilience. And then in 2.1c, making finance flows consistent with pathways towards low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. And here, I think it's clear this is about investment or moving investment away from fossil fuel-based investment into more sustainable low carbon development areas. But equally, and that's what I think the text suggests, but also the drafting history, from the global south to the global north. And I think in order to tackle climate change and prepare a just transition, but also to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic better and greener, that's absolutely crucial. And I think it's also to some extent at least reflected in the Executive Secretary's 6 principles on recovering better and in a more green and sustainable manner. And he, in one of his points, specifically says that fossil fuel subsidies must end and polluters must start paying for their pollution. So in the climate change context, where human rights are threatened, where damage is caused in one part of the world because of emissions 25, 30 years ago in another part of the world, I think that's fundamental. So from the international level to the more local, national level, here, I think in particular, climate litigation has created a bit of a momentum in recent years, particularly here in my part of the world. Human rights have been invoked in a number of cases, the right to life, for instance, physical and mental integrity, in order to force national governments to make more of an effort to increase their mitigation ambition. For instance, in the Netherlands, successfully, but there are similar cases pending in the courts of Germany, France, Spain. Interestingly, the climate cases in the South are usually related to climate response measures. And I think Kusum alluded to that. Here's, for instance, a big dam project that will create jobs and tackle and generate renewable energies that affects people's lives and people go to court about. So I think some of the main challenges for the lawyers in this context in the future will be to address the application of human rights globally, and not only when they're under the jurisdiction of a particular country. So in the climate change context, why should Uganda be responsible for human rights violations that are clearly and directly an effect of climate change and climate change caused in other countries? Climate-induced migration, I think that'll also be an important issue in the just transition context, because people will have to move and will want to move. And from the more reactive way of looking at this to a more proactive way, I think a lot of countries have a wide range of tools in their box on how to make the just transition easier, to facilitate it. And this is, of course, taxes, awareness raising, creating an enabling environment. But as a lawyer, I think that legislation because it's a democratic process, it's transparent. It also provides security to investors, to citizens. A government that comes into power cannot easily reverse legislation. That's different for policy. So I think legislation is an important tool. It comes with setting up a structure and a governance system that works. And in this connection, I think law and policy makers often need to look at the existing framework and need to decide, do we put in place some kind of overarching new law, or do we actually look at specific areas of the law and adjust those to the present conditions? I very much think that in that environment, in the climate change context, but also in the just transition, it is important to take fundamental decisions, and these fundamental decisions need to be enshrined in the law. And I'm not entirely sure whether we are still looking only at win-win solutions. I think, in the sustainable development context, we have been fooling ourselves a little bit. And I think rather than win-win, it's often now a matter of hard choices. And I would say, in order to successfully address those hard choices and come to the right conclusion, the law can help. And here we need to link the national and the international level. There are different ways to do this. I think one way probably is that we need to reach a certain degree of transitional justice, which means northern countries have to take responsibility for the mess they created. And then I think we can move on to a just transition collectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph, for the presentation. Very interesting. We'll take questions later, but we have now Dr. Sandra Piszczek who will be speaking. I know she has to run to another meeting as well, so hopefully we have enough time to listen to your speech. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me again, Rashida and team, and a privilege to share the screen with such a distinguished panel. I think my presentation really is about case study, regional case study. So I'm going to talk about Europe and the Polish region of Silesia and the context of UNFCCC COP24. But before I do it, I really wanted to connect to a very interesting speech given yesterday by Mr. Antonio Guterres, the state of the planet, because Mr. Guterres emphasized the human aspect of just transition. So today I really want to speak about people and mining communities. And ILO has very kindly mentioned the issue of social justice indeed. COP24, it is also my personal story of just transition, because very simply I went there and I wanted to do a project in connection with a region. It gave us also solidarity and just transition declaration that at the time placed the just transition issue in the center of climate change policies. And interestingly, COP took place on a former mine. So we were all at the time shocked. Out of all possible cities in Poland with UNESCO World Heritage Sites, there we were on a rehabilitation site of a former mine and that has been turned into a world-class museum and a concert hall. So this is a perfect example of adaptation, urban adaptation of mining industries and how this can look today. And I also went to see cities, mining cities. For the first site, I am an architect. They are an incredible engineering marvel when we put aside the issue of the CO2. But I think what is really interesting and important with the just transition stories when we think about urbanism and architecture, there are these amazing objects that are left empty for huge capacity of adaptation. So whilst we talk quite often on just transition in a context of mitigation, there are adaptation aspects and in a context of urbanism that certainly could be carried out, and they are being carried out in some places in the world, and particularly in Europe. But I also had an opportunity to meet mining communities. And here I really wanted to share with you the incredible story of mining culture. These communities have been there for around 500 years. They develop their own intangible heritage. And I think that the just transition really needs to take the aspect of communities as a package, of think holistically about the provision of jobs that will somehow retain these communities together, because I think this is really, really important in terms of social justice or social cohesions, making sure that these communities can stay, perhaps working in a different type of employment, but that they do stay together. And to give you some statistics, since 1992, around 49 mines were closed in the Polish Silesian region, but we have 46 mines still working, and they have a license to carry out their operations for the next 10 to 40 years. But there are worrying trends when we talk about people. The retiring age is quite young, 45, 55 years old. So you could just say this is the middle of a productive age. And indeed, as ILO has mentioned, there is a challenge for employment for women. And the unemployment of women is indeed very high. Now, what I also learned was a really lucrative, I learned about a very lucrative job offer that the miner would be given. And this was a job, excellent salary. And every miner would be given a house. So there was a whole community built for them. So your job comes with a house, but your job also comes with a place for families, schools, and the entire community. So this is this entire package that quite often young men probably couldn't resist. And paradoxically, I think that the green jobs do not offer that level of package I've mentioned. Probably we get a job and we get an income, but I think green jobs do not come with house, for example. So this is just something to think about in the future. The other aspect that I think is relevant is one mining job means 4 supply chain jobs. So we're talking about probably supply chain jobs, but also the mining family. So if we say there's a family of 4 plus the 4 supply chain jobs, we're talking about probably 8 to 9 jobs affiliated with one mining job. So this is making the just transition probably even harder. And I wanted to share with you a few success stories and case studies. This is a case study from Katowice Special Economic Zone. Over 24 years, they created 80,000 jobs, which I think is a great result. But what is interesting is to see this economic diversification into automotive sector, glass sector, steel sector, other industries. And this is really relevant to see these other sectors coming along and where the investment is and where these miners can find new jobs. And another case study is from rural metropolitan area in Germany, which I particularly like because it is exploring nature-based solutions. In a fashion of a European Union, we have around 10 or more municipalities working together, and over the period of 10 years, they've provided 97,000 green jobs. But what I think is interesting with this particular case study is livelihood strategies. There are livelihood strategies that have been provided for the mining communities, and I think with a strong emphasis on SDG 3, which is good health and well-being. Now, the geopolitics of global coal production are probably self-explanatory. You could see the role of America here, a former Soviet Union as well. But in general, the estimate is that in the world we have 132 years left in terms of production of coal globally. And I really wanted to mention European Union here for a moment because simply the European Green Deal offers just transition mechanism, which is actually really interesting, and countries in Europe are working on it very hard. The just transition mechanism has around 100 billion euros, and the countries are prepared to spend that funding over a period of 30 years. Now, the time here is very important, and I come back to it in a moment, but the the circular economy, I'm sorry, my slides are slightly tricky. The circular economy aspect here is very important as well. So I think in my mind, seeing the mining, the mines, and being there, I think that one of the biggest opportunities will be in the raw materials sectors and in the circular economy. And in the context of European Green Deal, we have a circular economy action plan. So there is just a lot of possibilities, but also a lot of research and development. I've mentioned time. And so you imagine today is 2020, and if we have 30 years for delivery of just transition, we're talking about 2050. And coincidentally, myself and Vashita are affiliated with UNFCCC Resilience Frontiers Initiative, led by Dr. Josef Nasser, Director of Adaptation. And I wanted to mention this because for over a year, we have been thinking about future. And I think that the future long-term thinking is absolutely critical here for a very simple reason that technology in 2050 might be very different to what we see today. So predictions are on automation. So which means loss of jobs, actually, not additional jobs. Yeah, and many, I mean, car industry right now is going into the aspects of automation. So generally, very difficult choices the governments and the regions need to make on what kind of industry and technology to invest and what will stand the test of time in the next 20, 30 years. And the same issue is with AI. In other words, tough choices that we will need to make, whether the provision of jobs will be for human hands or whether it will be for automation and robotics. And I probably want to use a quotation from Resilience Frontiers, where we're going to talk about Homo sapiens, Homo symbiosis, or Homo technicus. And young people are telling us very eloquently that we need to make these right choices, generally speaking. And we can ask ourselves whether we're going to see the end of mining during our lifetime. And I believe that we will not see the end of mining in general, because our dependence on raw materials and metals is still growing. You have to imagine that on this picture, probably everyone is having a mobile phone. And a mobile phone represents an element of mining. We are all now using computers during this webinar, and probably satellites. In each of these technological equipments, there is a piece of mining embedded into every gadget we're probably using. So the demand for mobile phones and for computers and satellites is going to be there. So it means that demand for mining will be there. The ILO mentioned about just transition and the UNFCCC in terms of regional priorities. So, I mean, even if we close mine in one region, it will be relocated to another region with probably lower social security, but the demand probably will be there and will be still stronger. So I think that the COVID-19 situation is actually is making the demand for the use of technology even stronger, but it means this is a bigger demand for certain metals and mining exploitation in the future as well. And to conclude, I wanted to say that mining industry is an incredible wealth creator for some. Just to give you some statistics, 3-year profits of few mines is reaching to over 180 billion US dollars. So I would like to leave my presentation with a reflection that just transition requires long-term thinking for leaving no one behind, and hopefully to leave the world less divisive, less polluting, less destructive, more inclusive, more equitable and fairer than the one we have left in pre-pandemic era. And this is my very best wishes also for the forthcoming 2021 year to all of you listening. Thank you. Vashita, over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. I think you paved the way for our next panel, which is about energy sector, which is starting in 1 hour. I know we've run out of time, but I would like to request whether the speakers could stay another 15 minutes and take a few questions, if that's okay with you. Okay, so I would like to request everyone who's joining us, if you have questions, please share them in the chat box or the question and answer section. There's already a question from Dr. Linda Stevenson to Sandra, so I'll read it out. It's in the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please ask them. I'll just ask the question to Sandra. How sustainable are the livelihood opportunities given to communities within or near a mining area? I think it will depend on the company and country. It might be difficult for mining companies in developing countries to sustain the livelihood opportunities provided. Should they be legally responsible to provide livelihood options or support infrastructure for the well-being of the community? That's for Sandra. Would you like to take it?
Sure, thank you. You know, I think that livelihoods opportunity, it's all what we right now talking in the context of SDGs, for example, and the Paris Agreement. So our way of thinking right now about development is providing cities with green spaces, with parks, thinking about the context of healthy food, public space. And I think that we just had this discussion about connecting various legislations that are on board right now. And I think the transition to the just transition is simply sustainable development. So I would see this as a one package, one developmental package with SDG 11 and other SDGs connected together, because this is the direction where the world is going. So I think that I understand that maybe in other parts of the world, the priorities could be different, but I think we all are moving in the direction of more sustainable livelihoods wherever we live, and certain aspects of these sustainable livelihoods are going to be the same regardless of geographical location. I don't know if I answered this correctly.
Right. Thank you, Sandra. There's a question for all the speakers. So I'll have the order as Mustafa, Kusum, and Christoph for this one. So the question is, other than the workforce as stated in the Paris Agreement, what else? Okay, so I think this is starting with Kusum. What else does UNFCCC consider in the Just Transition dialogue? Is just transition only by employment? What about loss and damage, for example? So I'll start with Kusum and then go to the others for their comments. Kusum, you could speak. Over to you, if you can hear.
Thank you, and very good question. I think that is why I even talked about in my presentation. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Please. Yes, can hear you. Yes.
Hello?
Okay, Kusum, we can all hear you, I think, at least I can. You could speak. Okay, I think we lost Kusum, or Kusum can't hear us. Until Kusum can hear us again, Christoph or Maggie, would you like to take the question? Would you like to answer?
I think Mustafa is probably much better prepared to answer that, but something I can maybe contribute here is that when we work with a lot of lawyers in developing countries, and at the moment, some of them feel frustrated by the focus of their governments on updating these NDCs, these nationally determined contributions. So the donors, for instance, they want them to be more ambitious. But what's falling off the radar is exactly this. How do you strategically create new skills? How do you change the system and invest in long-term strategies and programs that might not have immediate results, but then achieve exactly that, a better and a greener world? So my answer to that would be, unfortunately, at this point in time, no. And I think the reason a lot of developing countries really is that there's not sufficient resources.
Thank you, Christoph. Mustafa, would you like to add to it?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very important question. And for me, I just would like to reemphasize the point that we don't see just transition to be only a matter for workers. Obviously, the language in the Paris Agreement has, as Christoph has mentioned, speaks about just transition of workforce. However, when just transition was discussed at the International Labour Organization through a tripartite process where we had governments, workers, and employees organizations, the outcome was a guideline, a set of guidelines. It has a long name, but it ends by saying a just transition for all. And this means that there are issues of just transition for enterprises. And I think once Sandra was saying that a green job doesn't provide a home. So this means there are just transition issues for communities. You know, when a coal mine is closed somewhere, you know, we're talking about Katowice, for example, there are many communities, businesses that live around that coal mine. And so therefore, they all face issues of just transition. So therefore, it's important we keep this broad perspective that even though in the Paris Agreement, we speak legally of a just transition of the workforce, in real world situations, we must understand just transition as having implications for workers, but also communities, enterprises, and the broader understanding of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sandra, do you want to follow up on what? No? Okay, so we move to the next question. That is to all the speakers, and it's asking whether the countries are gearing enough to adjust the education systems to ensure just transition. Skills are transferred to community at large to be prepared to the new green world if it's going to come. Okay, so I think the question is about education. So who would like to take this? Mustafa, would that be for you or anyone else?
I mean, I can start very briefly. I think that the education system is not fit for purpose in some aspects for just transition, unfortunately. And I mean, I come from, obviously, I'm an architect, I'm trained as an architect, and I could say that we need to change the education system, definitely, probably from primary school or even kindergarten, though it's probably happening, but in terms of higher education, it needs recalibrating, certainly. That's my opinion.
Yes, if I may, I do share fully what Sandra has said, and I just presented earlier a global review of skills for green jobs that we conducted, and this global review was based on 32 country studies. What we find is that in many cases, countries are not really assessing the needs and gaps of their skills, and this goes back to the education systems. You know, when you look at skills in medium level skills, higher, low skill jobs, etc., there is a lot of gaps in terms of what is there and what countries would need to anticipate going into the future so that upcoming occupations can be fully fulfilled. So there is a lot to be done in this area, and obviously, yeah, we are all in agreement that there are gaps, and the system, as Sandra said, is not fully fit for purpose at this point.
Yeah, I think my previous answer responded to this question because I missed the other question about the just transition dialogue and what it means in the UNFCCC context, and what about loss and damage, for example. But I think my presentation did refer to this because I think just transition will only really be possible if there's a consolidated joint effort by the international community, and that would then, I think, involve shifting finance in a large scale from the north to the south in order to address loss and damage, harm to the environment, but also leapfrog certain development stages that, you know, we in the north here have experienced and limited the available atmospheric space for others significantly.
Thank you, everyone. I think Kusum is back, so I'll pass the mic to her to answer the question that was directed about the UNFCCC and the just transition, and also if you want to add anything on the education aspect. Kusum, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can
we
you
can
hear
hear you.
me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Can you hear me, please?
Kusum, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I don't know what is happening because I was trying to even speak when the question was posed, but my voice was not the workforce. It is also about businesses. It is also about firms. It is also about banking system. It is also about our governments. So transition is happening for everyone. So it's not only about only workforce. But what I meant that in UNFCCC, in the convention, it is only limited to workforce as a formal incorporation in the work plan. So when the discussions in the Katowice committee is taking place, many a times you will see that they are limited to the workforce because it says very clearly just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. So we are talking about workforce and we are talking about creating jobs which are decent. And coming to the the loss and damage, I think loss and damage is completely a different topic altogether because this talks about what damages are happening because of climate change. It
I think we lost Kusum again. Yes, I hope she can join us again. We have like 2 minutes more. I actually had a question for Mustafa. If others wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask that question. Because we're talking a lot about the energy sector, we're talking about the mining community, but we also have just transition other sectors as well. So what about the food sector? Do you have any work that ILO or anyone else in the group is working on related to food sector? If yes, could you give a bit of information on this? I think that could be the closing for this session because we have something coming up in a very short time.
Well, just quickly on our side, I must say a lot of our work has been looking at the energy sector, but obviously there are a lot of issues with the food sector, not only because of physical impacts of climate. We know about the failed crops and what needs to be done in terms of insurance mechanisms. There has been some ILO pilot projects on index-based insurance mechanism, which we have used in the Philippines, in Ethiopia, Kenya, etc., working with farmers on small-scale mechanisms for them to insure against climatic risks in the agricultural sector. But we must say that there is a little more, I'm not little even, much more work and effort which is needed to understand impacts in the food, agriculture and food sector more broadly.
Okay, thank you very much. Sandra, do you need to leave? Yes, okay. So Sandra needs to leave. So big thank you to Sandra. But I think I would like to ask for closing remarks from all of you as to what you see could be the projection for the summit discussion. Because as you know, we are taking this discussion forward in 3 thematic sessions in the next, hours and the next day. And then we bring all this back to a closing session where we discuss what can be done. And there'll be also a knowledge product as an output of these discussions, which can be shared. So what do you see that we need to kind of focus on in the next discussions? And what would be the things that you think as different stakeholders we need to do to ensure that climate change actions and just transition is something long-term and that climate action is not going to hinder a lot of communities that are vulnerable already due to different reasons related to workforce and other aspects that you highlighted. So should I start with Sandra and then go to the others?
Thank you.
Sandra?
Thank you. I think that this is connecting to my discussion with Christoph just before the session. I personally wouldn't separate just transition from existing dialogue on sustainable development and the implementation of Paris Agreement. This is part of this one package, and try to see linkages with the process of just transition with already existing agreements and commitments that we have on the table as a part of one journey towards a better, more sustainable future.
Thank you, Sandra. Could I ask Christopher to go next? I mean, Christoph. I keep saying Christopher for some reason. Sorry, Christoph.
Thank you. I think it's very difficult to talk about just transition in general. I think I've tried to highlight that in my presentation a little bit. I think it very much depends on the national context, on the national priorities and challenges. So I think maybe the best outcome of your discussions can be to highlight the issues and the subject areas that we need to balance when we decide on a just way forward. Thank you.
Mustafa, over to you.
Well, I just wanted to say that yesterday, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres delivered an address on the state of the planet at Columbia University. I would invite colleagues to take a look. And he speaks of the importance of jobs and just transition, social impacts of climate action, as well as the opportunities. And I just want to mention two important things for me, which we can build on. One is that countries are at this point reviewing their nationally determined contribution, their NDCs. This is a unique opportunity to push for the integration of just transition measures and policies in those NDCs so that this becomes an integral part of the response to climate change. And the second dimension is about financing. Countries should seek financing not only for mitigation and adaptation, but financing for just transition policies. So I think these are two important areas that I would encourage us to engage in following up, because the window of opportunity is very narrow. It was a pleasure, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join the session.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. A big thank you to the speakers and to Kusum, who is unfortunately not with us at the moment. And thank you to the, you're back? Okay. Is she there? No, okay. No.
I am.
Oh, you are, sorry. Please, would you like to add anything, please?
Yeah, let's see. I hope it goes till end. I think the one important thing which also can be discussed is that how countries who are going to be impacted by these transition or climate policies coming up, they can benefit from the jobs which have been created. This is another aspect which has to be focused when we are working towards making transition. Because there are a lot of developing countries who are already not having enough jobs. And then when we are talking about jobs have been created, the studies are demonstrating that. So how they can, in this all this value addition change, where they can actually tap in and benefit from this as well, so that we are more inclusive and we are going towards sustainable development for everyone. Thank you.
Tricia. Thank you very much, Kusum. I'm glad that you could join us for the final comments. So a big thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to the UNFCCC for leading this session with us. We have in 30 minutes a session that is on the energy sector, which you can see. You're most welcome to join us and be part of the discussion. I think we can take forward what we discussed here, and some of the speakers are already in the chat and asking questions as well. So Look forward to joining you in about 30 minutes, and bye for now from my end. Thank you.